It was a tragedy, Lady Arabella Corbett would often say with a theatrical sigh, that dear Constance had no head for society. Her mind, she would confide to whichever guest was taking tea, is all figures and ink. She shall make some dusty old solicitor a perfectly adequate wife, I suppose, if one can be found who does not mind a bride with no dowry to speak of. The cruelty was twofold, and Constance Abbott, standing just out of sight in the hall, felt the familiar, cold clench in her stomach. The first cruelty was the lie. The second was the truth it concealed. The tragedy, Constance knew, was that her own inheritance, left by her father and meticulously documented in a ledger her aunt kept locked in a rosewood box, would have provided a very handsome dowry indeed. But Lady Corbett was her guardian, and the funds were hers to manage until Constance, at 25, was respectably married. The years ticked by, and Constance remained unmarried, her aunt's management consisting of drawing upon the funds for gowns, for carriage repairs, for card debts, each withdrawal a small, silent theft that Constance was powerless to stop. Her role in the household was that of an unpaid secretary, a ghost in grey bombazine who kept the accounts, managed the staff, and ensured the entire precarious enterprise of Lady Corbett's social aspirations did not collapse into ruin. She was 24, and her life was a column of figures that never balanced in her favor. She did not cry. She had learned long ago, at the age of 10 when her parents' carriage had overturned on a wet road to Marley, that tears changed nothing. They did not mend broken wheels or broken lives. What mattered was what one did next. And so, Constance did what she always did. She endured, she recorded, she remembered. Every evening, she would retreat to her small, cold room at the top of the house, and, in a tiny notebook of her own, she would replicate the figures from her aunt's official ledger. It was a small act of rebellion, a testament to a truth only she knew. One day, she thought, the accounting would come. The day it began was unremarkable. Lady Corbett was hosting a small musicale, a dreary affair designed to impress the new gentleman who had taken a lease on a nearby property, a Mr. Randolph Vickers. He was all polished boots and easy compliments, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Constance, as usual, was expected to be invisible, to ensure the sherry was poured and the candles remained lit. She was standing near the French doors, checking the wicks of a candelabra, when she overheard Mr. Vickers holding forth on the subject of agricultural management. "The trouble with the modern tenant," he declared, swirling his brandy, "is a lack of moral fiber. They plead poverty, but it is indolence. I was just speaking with a fellow whose lands abut the Kestrel Chase estate. The Duke's holdings at Dunsmere are a disgrace. Tenants refusing to pay, the land gone to ruin. The Duke has lost 3 stewards in as many years." An older man, with a face like carved granite, grunted from his chair by the fire. "The Duke of Kestrel Chase does not suffer fools, Vickers. If 3 stewards have failed, the problem may not be the tenants." Constance recognized him as Mr. Gideon Fenwick, the local magistrate, a man known for his sharp mind and sharper tongue. Vickers waved a dismissive hand. "Sinclair is a recluse. A war hero, they say, but what does a soldier know of crop rotation? He sits in that cold mausoleum of his and counts his money. The Dunsmere tenants need a firm hand, not another failed academic with a book on soil composition." "The soil at Dunsmere is heavy clay," a quiet voice stated. The small group turned. Constance froze, horrified to have spoken aloud. All eyes were upon her. Her aunt's face was a mask of fury. "It requires careful drainage and a 3-year rotation, with clover or vetch in the 3rd year to return nitrogen to the soil. Otherwise the yields collapse. A firm hand cannot change the nature of the earth." There was a stunned silence. Mr. Vickers looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture that had suddenly offered an opinion on politics. He gave a short, condescending laugh. "And what would a slip of a girl know of such things?" Before Constance could stammer an apology, a new voice cut through the room, cold and precise as winter ice. "She knows a great deal more than you, it would seem." The voice came from the doorway. Every head turned. Lucian Sinclair, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, stood there, unannounced. He was tall and severe, his face handsome but devoid of warmth, his eyes a pale, chilling gray. He was not a recluse, Constance realized. He was a fortress. His gaze was not on the simpering Mr. Vickers or on her horrified aunt. It was fixed, with an unnerving intensity, directly on her. He had seen her. When no one else ever did, he had seen her. And in that moment, for the first time in years, the columns of figures in Constance's mind wavered, replaced by a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of hope. The Duke's presence shattered the cozy atmosphere of the musicale. Lady Corbett fluttered around him, a flurry of apologies and sycophantic greetings, but his attention remained unnervingly fixed. He gave her only a curt nod, his gaze sweeping the room before returning to Constance, who felt pinned in place like a moth under glass. "Miss Abbott," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low, yet it carried an authority that silenced all other chatter. "You have studied agricultural methods?" "I have read on the subject, Your Grace," she managed, her own voice sounding thin to her ears. Her father had been a gentleman farmer, his library her only real inheritance besides the money her aunt now controlled. She had devoured his books on husbandry, estate management, and law. They were stories of a world that made sense, a world of cause and effect, unlike the capricious drawing-room society she was forced to inhabit. "She reads far too much," Lady Corbett interjected with a nervous titter. "It fills her head with useless notions. Pay her no mind, Your Grace." The Duke paid her aunt no mind whatsoever. "The Dunsmere tenancy," he said, his eyes still locked on Constance, "is without a steward. The lands are failing. The rents are 5 years in arrears. The people are difficult." Mr. Vickers, recovering his swagger, stepped forward. "Precisely as I was saying, Duke, they require discipline, a man with military experience, perhaps." He puffed out his chest slightly. Lucian Sinclair's gaze flickered to Vickers, and for a single, terrifying second, Constance saw something ancient and dangerous in their depths. It was the look of a wolf assessing a yapping terrier. "I have had men with military experience," the Duke said, his voice dropping even lower. "I have had academics. I have had seasoned factors from the north. They all failed. They saw the tenants as the problem. You," he said, turning his full attention back to Constance, "saw the soil." It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon's diagnosis. He was not interested in her as a woman or a social entity. He was interested in her mind. It was the most thrilling and terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. "My carriage is without," he announced to the room at large. "Miss Abbott, you will accompany me to Kestrel Chase. We have business to discuss." It was a command, not an invitation. A wave of shock rippled through the guests. Lady Corbett's jaw dropped. "Your Grace, it is entirely improper. A young, unmarried lady." She will be chaperoned by my housekeeper, Mrs. Granger, a woman of impeccable character and 60 years, the Duke stated flatly, cutting off the protest. The business is of a financial nature that may be of interest to you, Lady Corbett. It concerns the recovery of a significant sum of money. Greed warred with propriety on her aunt's face, and, as always, greed won. The mention of money, especially a significant sum, was an irresistible lure. She stammered her assent, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. A wealthy duke taking an interest in her penniless niece? The implications were dazzling. Constance, however, felt a different kind of thrill. It was not the thrill of a potential courtship, which seemed as likely as the Duke suddenly taking up embroidery. It was the sharp, clean thrill of opportunity. For the first time, someone was speaking a language she understood. Not flattery, but business. Not social maneuvering, but a problem to be solved. She fetched her plainest bonnet and cloak, her hands moving with a steady purpose that belied the frantic beating of her heart. As she passed her aunt in the hall, Lady Corbett gripped her arm, her fingers digging in like talons. "Constance," she hissed, her eyes gleaming. "You will be charming. You will be agreeable. Do not, for the love of God, mention crop rotation again. This is your chance. Our chance. Do not ruin it." But Constance knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it was precisely her knowledge of crop rotation that had created this chance. It was the one thing she possessed that was truly her own. As she stepped out of the cloying, perfumed air of her aunt's house and into the crisp night, the Duke was waiting by his carriage. He did not offer a hand to help her up. He simply held the door, waiting, as if she were an equal he was expecting to manage on her own. And in that simple, unchivalrous gesture, she felt a profound and unfamiliar sense of respect. The journey to Kestrel Chase was made in near total silence, the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves the only sound inside the dark, cavernous carriage. Constance sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her mind a whirlwind. Kestrel Chase was not a house, it was a monument. It rose from the landscape under the moonlight, a vast, Gothic pile of stone that seemed to have been carved from the very bones of the earth. It was magnificent and utterly unwelcoming. Not a single unnecessary light burned in its dozens of windows. It looked as cold and sealed as its master. They were met at the door by a severe-looking woman in a black dress, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face taut. This was Mrs. Granger. She curtsied to the Duke and eyed Constance with open suspicion. "Tea, Mrs. Granger? In the library," the Duke commanded, striding past them down a cavernous, echoing hall. The library was the only room that felt alive. Books soared to the ceiling on 3 walls, and a fire, newly lit, crackled in a fireplace large enough to roast an ox. The Duke did not invite Constance to sit. He went to a massive oak desk, lit a branch of candles, and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. It was the same size and shape as the ones Constance managed for her aunt, but this one was worn, its cover scuffed, its spine threatening to break. He laid it open on the desk. "The Dunsmere accounts," he said. "A fiction of incompetence and theft dating back a decade. I want you to look at it." Constance approached the desk. She looked down at the pages. They were a nightmare of chaotic entries, spidery handwriting, and angry, blotted corrections. But beneath the chaos, she could see the faint, orderly lines of the ledger itself. She could see the ghost of what it was supposed to be. "The last steward claimed the tenants were threatening him," the Duke continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "He claimed they sabotaged the drainage ditches and burned a hayrick. He fled in the night, taking the petty cash and the rent roll with him." Constance ran a finger over a column of figures. The ink was smeared. "This entry," she said softly, "for seed corn." The quantity listed would only be sufficient for half the acreage of the home farm, yet the cost is double what it should be. The Duke was silent for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her, sharp and analytical. "You see it," he said. It was not a question. "I see a story of mismanagement at best," Constance replied, her voice gaining strength, "and deliberate fraud at worst." "I do not employ stewards to manage my estates from Marley," he said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "The position requires residence. At Dunsmere," he paused, "there is a steward's house, Sorrel Down. It has been empty for some time. It is rustic." Constance's heart began to beat a little faster. She understood where this was heading. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only door that had ever opened for her in her entire life. "I am not offering you a position as a lady's companion, Miss Abbott. I am not in need of a hostess or a decorative presence. I am in need of a steward, someone who can read a ledger and is not intimidated by mud or angry farmers. Someone who understands the difference between a firm hand and a smart one." He named a salary. It was a respectable sum, more than enough for a single woman to live on. But then he added the clause that made her breath catch in her throat. "You will have 1 year," he said, his gray eyes boring into hers, "to restore order, to make the farms productive, to collect the back rents. For every pound of the arrears you recover for the estate, 20 shillings will be your own." Constance did the calculation in her head instantly. The arrears, if the ledger was even remotely accurate, were in the thousands of pounds. Her share would not just be enough for independence. It would be a fortune. It would be the key that could unlock her entire life, freeing her from her aunt forever. It was freedom, offered in the form of a business contract. "My aunt will never agree," she said, the words tasting like ash. "A woman living alone, managing an estate. The scandal." "Your aunt," the Duke said, a flicker of something like contempt in his voice, "will agree when I explain to her that your salary and commission will be paid directly to you, but that I will offer her a separate, not insignificant sum for the release of your guardianship. A finder's fee, let us call it." He understood. He understood that her aunt's morality was a commodity, to be bought and sold like any other. He was purchasing Constance's freedom, not as a romantic gesture, but as a business expense. "The work will be difficult," he warned. "The house is cold. The people are hostile. You will likely fail." Constance looked from the Duke's hard, unreadable face to the chaotic ledger on the desk. She thought of her aunt's cloying perfumes, of Mr. Vickers' greasy smile, of the endless, silent humiliations. She thought of the little notebook hidden under a loose floorboard in her room, the only thing in the world that was truly hers. Failure at Dunsmere would be cold and lonely, but it would be a failure of her own making. Success, however, success would be redemption. "I accept your terms, Your Grace," Constance Abbott said, her voice as steady and clear as a winter morning. "When do I begin?" The journey to Dunsmere was a descent into a different world. Constance traveled not in the Duke's grand carriage, but in a sturdy, plain gig, a silent groom driving the horse. Her possessions amounted to a single trunk, containing her few gray dresses, her precious notebook, and the handful of books her aunt had not deemed valuable enough to sell. As they left the manicured lands around Kestrel Chase and rattled towards the estate's forgotten corner, the landscape changed. Fences sagged. Gates hung from single hinges. The very air seemed heavier, laden with damp and neglect. Sorrel Down, the steward's house, was even more grim than the Duke's description had implied. It was a small stone house, huddled under a slate roof, green with moss. A tangled, dead garden choked the front, and the windows were filmed with grime. It looked less like a home and more like a place of exile. Waiting on the doorstep was Mrs. Granger, the Duke's housekeeper, her expression as welcoming as a locked door. She had been sent ahead to open the house. "His Grace's orders," she said, her voice clipped. She gestured inside. "There's a bed and a hearth. The rest is for you to manage." The inside was cold, a deep, penetrating cold that clung to the stone walls and seemed to rise from the flagstone floors. It smelled of damp, disuse, and mice. A fire had been laid in the main room's hearth, but not lit. It was a test, Constance realized. Everything was a test. "Thank you, Mrs. Granger," Constance said calmly. "I am sure I shall be quite comfortable once I have things in order." The older woman just grunted and handed her a large iron key. "There's wood in the shed, water from the well. A woman from the village, a Bess, will come by tomorrow with milk, if she decides you're worth the trouble." With that, Mrs. Granger turned and marched back to the waiting gig, leaving Constance utterly alone. Constance stood in the center of the cold, dusty room. The silence was absolute. For a single, dizzying moment, the enormity of her task threatened to overwhelm her. She was alone, in a half-derelict house, surrounded by hostile strangers, charged with an impossible task. She could fail. She could be humiliated, sent back to her aunt in disgrace, her one chance for freedom lost forever. Then she caught sight of her trunk. Inside was the Dunsmere ledger. The problem. The thing she understood. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She did not cry. She had work to do. First, she found the tinderbox and lit the fire. Then she opened all the windows, letting the damp but fresh air circulate. She found a broom and began to sweep, the rhythmic scrape of bristles on stone, a comforting, purposeful sound. She worked until her back ached and her hands were raw, but by nightfall, the main room was clean, the fire was blazing, and a kettle was singing on the hob. She ate a dry piece of bread from her travel bag and drank hot tea from a chipped mug she'd found in the scullery. It was the most satisfying meal of her life. The next morning, as promised, a knock came at the door. A young woman with wary eyes and a worn shawl stood there, holding a pail of milk. This was Bess. "Mrs. Granger said you'd be wanting this," she said, not meeting Constance's eye. "Thank you," Constance said, taking the pail. "What is your husband's name?" The woman looked startled. "Jem, why?" "His name is in the Duke's ledger," Constance said plainly. "I wish to walk the boundary of your tenancy this afternoon, if he would be so good as to show me." Bess's suspicion deepened. "The last steward only walked as far as the door to demand coin." "I am not the last steward," Constance said. "I need to see the state of the fences and the South Fields drainage ditch. The ledger says it was repaired last spring. I would like to see the work." This was a new approach. The woman hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "I'll tell him. He'll be in the South Field after midday." That afternoon, Constance pulled on a pair of sturdy boots she'd found in the scullery and walked out to meet Jem. He was a gaunt, grim-faced man who watched her approach with his arms crossed over his chest. He did not offer a greeting. "You're the new one," he stated. "I am Constance Abbott," she replied. "And you are Jem. I would like to see the drainage ditch." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "What ditch? Filled in with mud 2 winters ago. Master Vickers, man, the old steward. He took the Duke's money for it, but the work was never done. We lost half the crop to rot." Constance felt a cold knot of anger. It was exactly as she'd suspected. She pulled out her small notebook and a pencil. "Show me," she said. For the next 4 hours, Jem walked her over his land. He was reluctant at first, speaking in monosyllables. But as she listened, truly listened, and made careful notes about the broken gate, the collapsed barn roof, the field choked with thistle because they couldn't afford the seed for a fallow crop, he began to talk. He told her a story of neglect, of broken promises, and of a corruption that ran far deeper than a single steward. The previous steward had worked in concert with Mr. Randolph Vickers, who leased the neighboring land. They had conspired to misappropriate funds meant for repairs, imposed illegal fees on the tenants, and bought the tenants' grain at brutally low prices, only to sell it at a profit in the markets at Marley. The tenants had not paid rent because they had nothing left to give, and because they knew the money would never reach the Duke anyway. As she walked back to Sorrel Down in the fading light, her boots caked in mud, a large, shaggy hound fell into step beside her. It was a deerhound of some kind, its coat matted, its ribs showing. It had the same wary, haunted look as the tenants. She'd seen it lurking around the woods, belonging to no one. It followed her to the door of the house, but would come no closer. She put out a bowl of water and a piece of bread. The dog watched her, unblinking, from a distance. She went inside and named him Bramble. That night, she did not look at the Duke's ledger. She started a new one. On the first page she wrote, "Dunsmere Restoration Account." She began to document, with precise detail, everything Jem had told her, cross-referencing it with the fraudulent entries in the old book. She was not just an accountant. She was an investigator. Over the next few weeks, a routine was established. Every day, Constance would visit another tenancy, walking the fields, listening to the stories, and filling her notebook. She spoke of rents not as a demand, but as a distant future obligation, one that could only be met once the land itself was healed. She learned the names of wives and children, the histories of every field and copse. In the evenings, she would transfer her notes into the new ledger, creating a true and accurate record of the state of Dunsmere. She used a small portion of her own meager funds, the last of her pocket money, to purchase nails for Jem to repair his gate and a sack of lime for another farmer to sweeten a sour field. They were small gestures, but they were honest. They were investments. One evening, she returned to find a basket on her doorstep. Inside were 2 fresh eggs and a small pot of honey. There was no note. That night, when she put the bowl out for Bramble, he crept a little closer to the porch before eating, and when she went to bed, she found a warm brick wrapped in flannel, tucked between the cold sheets. Mrs. Granger had evidently made a return trip from Kestrel Chase, unannounced and unseen. The house was still cold, but for the first time, Constance did not feel entirely alone. The transformation was not just in her ledger. It was in the small, grudging acknowledgments of her existence. It was the slow, quiet turning of a key in a long rusted lock. 2 months into her tenure, the Duke of Kestrel Chase arrived, unannounced, on a grey Tuesday morning. He found Constance not in the house, but in the south field with Jem, her skirts muddied, her hair escaping its pins, pointing at a newly cleared drainage ditch. Bramble, the wild hound, was sitting calmly by her side. Lucian Sinclair reined in his horse and simply watched for a moment. He had expected to find her huddled by the fire, defeated, ready to concede. He had been so certain she would fail. It was, he had told himself, the most likely outcome. A gentlewoman, no matter how intelligent, could not possibly succeed where hardened men had fled. He had made the offer almost as a cruel experiment, a test to see if her unique brand of competence was as real as it had seemed in that overheated drawing room. Seeing her there, in the mud, speaking with the tenant not as a superior but as a partner, a strange and unfamiliar feeling stirred in his chest. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was admiration. Constance saw him, and her heart gave a lurch. She straightened up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Your Grace," she said, her voice even. Jem, seeing the Duke, immediately tensed, his hand going to the handle of his shovel. It was an old, ingrained reflex of fear and defiance. "Jem?" Constance said quietly, not taking her eyes off the Duke. "This is the Duke of Kestrel Chase. He has come to inspect our work on the ditch." The use of the word "our" was not lost on Lucian. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the damp earth. He did not look at the tenant. He looked at the ditch. It was not perfect, but it was functional. Water was flowing freely for the first time in years. "The cost?" he asked, his voice clipped. "2 shillings for a new shovel head," Constance replied. "Jem and his sons provided the labor, in lieu of a portion of their arrears for the month. It is all recorded." He nodded slowly. He walked the length of the ditch, his gaze missing nothing. Then he turned to Jem. "The old steward reported you refused to do this work." Jem flinched, but stood his ground. "He wanted coin for the Duke's shovels, and kept the coin. And he lied about the Duke's orders. Miss Abbott, she just brought the shovel." Lucian's eyes met Constance's over the man's head. In them, she saw a flicker of something she could not name. He had heard the truth from a dozen reports, but hearing it from the mouth of a tenant, next to the physical proof of the lie, was different. He gave a curt nod. "Good work," he said to both of them, before turning and striding back to his horse. "Miss Abbott, walk with me." She fell into step beside him as he led the horse back towards Sorrel Down. Bramble trotted at her heels. "The dog seems to have adopted you," he remarked. "He was abandoned," she said simply. "He needed a purpose." "As did you," he replied, and the observation was so astute, so close to the bone, that she had no answer for it. Back at the house, she led him not to a parlor, but to the main room, which now served as her office. The great oak table was covered in papers, but they were neat, ordered stacks. Her new ledger lay open in the center. The room was clean, and the air smelled of wood smoke and beeswax. He went straight to the ledger. He did not touch it, but read the open page, his expression unreadable. She had detailed the cost of the shovel, the hours of labor provided by Jem and his sons, and the exact amount of arrears she had credited against that labor. It was a perfect, transparent accounting. He turned the page, and another. He spent nearly 20 minutes in complete silence, reading the record of her first 2 months. A record of small repairs, of agreements made, of trust slowly being built. A record of how a broken thing could be mended, not with force, but with methodical care. Finally, he closed the book. "You have spent your own money." 31 shillings and 4 pence, she confirmed. "On nails, a shovel head, and seed. It is recorded as a debt owed to me by the estate." "The estate will reimburse you," he said. He looked around the spare, clean room. "Mrs. Granger reports that you are managing." "Mrs. Granger leaves warm bricks in my bed and does not tell me she is doing it," Constance countered gently. "Her reports may be incomplete." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, so fleeting she thought she might have imagined it. "She is not easily impressed." He paused. "Neither am I." The implication hung in the air between them. He was impressed. This quiet approval was more intoxicating than any flattery she had ever received. It was a validation not of her face or her family, but of her work, of herself. But the world outside of Dunsmere was not so easily impressed. As Constance's influence with the tenants grew, so did the resentment of the man whose corrupt enterprise she was dismantling. Mr. Randolph Vickers began to hear whispers. Whispers of the Duke's new Steward, an unmarried woman living alone. Whispers of tenants suddenly finding the will to repair their own barns. He saw his web of influence, his quiet, profitable arrangements with the grain merchants in Marley, beginning to unravel. His campaign began subtly. At dinners and hunts, he would make casual remarks. "A strange business at Dunsmere. The Duke has installed a slip of a girl to run the place. Quite improper. One hears the tenants are running wild, taking advantage of her." Then the rumors grew more pointed, more vicious. They were whispers of immorality, of a woman of loose character who had somehow bewitched the reclusive Duke. He painted her as a usurper, an adventuress who was lining her own pockets at the Duke's expense. The county, which had once pitied Constance as Lady Corbett's drab niece, now began to look upon her with suspicion and scorn. Lady Corbett herself, mortified by the scandal and furious that Constance's notoriety was not the kind that led to a glittering marriage, wrote her a series of scathing, hysterical letters, which Constance read and then calmly fed to the fire. The slander was meant to isolate her, to turn the local gentry against her and pressure the Duke to remove her. But it had an unintended effect. The tenants of Dunsmere, who had felt the sting of Vickers's cruelty for years, recognized his poison. They had seen Constance's character with their own eyes. They had seen her walk through mud to inspect a roof, had seen her share her own meager supplies, had seen the honest figures in her little notebook. Vickers's lies did not sway them. They solidified their loyalty. Vickers, realizing his whispers were not having the desired effect on the ground, decided he needed to escalate. He could not allow Constance to succeed. Her success would not just be the end of his income, it would be the exposure of his crimes. He needed to create a crisis so severe that the Duke would have no choice but to remove her. He needed to make her appear not just immoral, but incompetent and dangerous. He needed to break the trust she had so painstakingly built. And he knew just how to do it. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The attack came on a bitter morning in late November. A hard frost silvered the ground, and the air was sharp with the promise of snow. Constance was reviewing her accounts when she heard a frantic knocking at her door. It was Bess, Jem's wife, her face pale with terror. "Miss Abbott, you must come. It's a notice, pinned to our door. Constance grabbed her cloak and followed Bess at a run. A small crowd of other tenants had gathered outside Jem's cottage, their faces a mixture of fear and fury. Pinned to the rough wood of the door was a sheet of formal parchment, a blob of red wax gleaming at the bottom. Constance pulled the nail free and read the document. It was a formal notice of eviction for Jem and his family for failure to pay their arrears in full. It cited their continued defiance and ordered them to vacate the property within a fortnight or be removed by force. The language was cold, legal, and brutal. And at the bottom, next to a perfect impression of the ducal seal, was the signature: Kestrel Chase. A wave of sickness washed over her. It was a masterful forgery. The handwriting was a near-perfect imitation of the Duke's clipped, severe script. The seal was flawless. To anyone who did not know him intimately, it was utterly convincing.
"We trusted you,"
a man shouted from the crowd. It was another farmer, Abel, a man she had helped just last week to rehang a barn door. "You said the Duke was a fair man. This is not fair." "She's been playing us false all along," another voice cried. "Working for him, to soften us up before he throws us all out." The trust she had spent months building was shattering like ice under a hammer. They were turning on her, their fear and desperation curdling into rage. "This is not from the Duke," Constance said, her voice ringing with a conviction she prayed they would hear. "I know his hand. I know his mind. He would not do this." "It has his seal," Jem said, his voice ragged. He pointed a trembling finger at the wax. "His name is on it. What more proof do we need?" The crowd pressed closer, their mood growing uglier. They were a mob in the making, and she was the focus of their wrath. For the first time, Constance felt a genuine spike of fear. She was alone, surrounded, her word against the damning evidence of the document in her hand. It was then that she heard the sound of a horse approaching at a gallop. The crowd parted as Lucian Sinclair rode into their midst, his face a thundercloud. He had clearly heard news of the unrest and ridden hard from Kestrel Chase. He swung down from his horse, his eyes taking in the scene, the angry crowd, the terrified Bess, and Constance, standing alone in the center of it all, holding the parchment. His gaze fell upon the eviction notice in her hand. He strode towards her and took it from her without a word. He studied it, his expression unreadable. For a long, agonizing moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. This was the test. Everything she had done, every honest entry in her ledger, every step in the mud, hung in the balance, waiting for his judgment. He looked up from the page, and his eyes met hers. She saw it then, just for a flicker of a second, a sliver of ice. Doubt. He was a man who prized evidence above all else, and the evidence in his hand was powerful. It was his signature. It was his seal. It was the single most painful moment of her life. The forgery was good. Frighteningly good. As Lucian held the parchment, he felt a cold fury settle in his gut. The signature was nearly his own, the seal a perfect copy. He had spent years cultivating a reputation for being hard but meticulously fair. This document, this lie, used his own name as a weapon against his people. His first, instinctual reaction was to find the source of the forgery and destroy it. But then he looked at the faces of his tenants. He saw their fear, their rage, directed at the one person who had done more for them in 3 months than any of his stewards had in 5 years. And then he looked at her. Constance Abbott. She stood her ground, her chin up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was not crying. She was not pleading. She was watching him, her gaze direct and unwavering, as if challenging him to see the truth. In her eyes, he did not see guilt or fear of discovery. He saw disappointment. She was disappointed in him, for the flicker of doubt she had surely seen in his own eyes. And in that instant, the doubt vanished, replaced by a crystalline certainty. He weighed the evidence. On one side, a piece of paper, expertly crafted to deceive. On the other, 3 months of relentless, methodical, honest work. He thought of the neatly cleared ditch. He thought of the dog that had been wild for a year, now sitting at her feet. He thought of the warm brick Mrs. Granger had confessed to leaving, so the poor girl doesn't catch her death in that damp box. He thought of her ledger, a testament to integrity so profound it was almost a work of art. He had built his life on evidence, and the evidence of Constance Abbott's character was overwhelming. The paper in his hand was the outlier. The paper was the lie. He turned to the crowd, his voice ringing with an authority that had commanded men on the battlefield. "This is a forgery." Returned to Constance's perspective. The Duke's words cut through the angry murmurs, silencing them instantly. "This is a forgery," he repeated, his voice like stone. He held the document up for all to see. "My seal has a flaw, a tiny scratch across the kestrel's wing, from when I dropped it during the war. This seal is perfect. Therefore, it is false." He turned his gaze on Constance, and the ice was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fire. It was the fire of alliance. "Miss Abbott has served this estate with more integrity than any steward in its history. You have seen her work. You have seen her character. Yet you choose to believe a lie on a piece of paper designed to incite you." Shame washed over the faces in the crowd. Jem looked at the ground. Abel shuffled his feet. "The question," the Duke continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm, "is who benefits from such a lie? Who profits when you are driven from your homes and this estate falls back into chaos?" He did not need to say the name. Everyone knew. The shadow of Randolph Vickers fell over them all. "There will be a reckoning," the Duke said. "But it will be my reckoning, not a mob's." He looked at Jem. "You will not be evicted. You will remain in your home. And you will help Miss Abbott discover who delivered this notice." He then turned to Constance, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "I require a full report on this matter. In the library, at Kestrel Chase. Tonight." It was an order, but it was also an invitation. It was a declaration of trust. He was pulling her into the fortress to stand beside him as he went to war. That evening, in the great library, they planned their counterattack. It was not a discussion between a master and a servant. It was a council of war between 2 generals. Constance, with her meticulous records and intimate knowledge of the tenants, provided the intelligence. The Duke, with his wealth, power, and tactical mind, devised the strategy. "Vickers is arrogant," Lucian said, pacing before the fire. "He believes he is untouchable. We will use that arrogance against him." "He must be exposed publicly," Constance insisted. "A private accusation will be dismissed as my word against his. The entire county must see him for what he is." "I agree." The Duke stopped pacing and looked at her. "I am calling a formal tenants' assembly at Kestrel Chase to hear grievances. I will request the presence of Mr. Fenwick, the magistrate, to ensure all is done legally. And I will invite the local gentry, including Mr. Vickers and your aunt." Constance understood at once. It was a trap. A stage play, where Vickers would be invited to play the leading role, not realizing he was the villain who would be unmasked in the final act. "He will attend," Constance said. "He will not be able to resist the chance to see me publicly humiliated." "Precisely," the Duke said. A grim satisfaction settled on his features. "He will walk onto our stage, and we will let him build his own gallows." He paused, then took a step closer. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the mask of the cold, remote Duke fell away for a moment. "He tried to destroy you, Constance." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his voice, in that quiet, firelit room, was more intimate than any touch. "He underestimated me," she replied, her voice steady. "No," Lucian said softly. "He did not know you. He saw a woman to be victimized. He did not see a mind that could dismantle him, piece by piece. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently tap the cover of her new ledger, which lay on the desk between them. This is your weapon, and it will be his undoing." The day of the tenants' assembly was cold and bright. The great hall of Kestrel Chase, usually so silent and empty, buzzed with a nervous energy. On one side sat the tenants of Dunsmere, scrubbed and solemn, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension. On the other side sat the local gentry, drawn by the promise of drama. Lady Arabella Corbett was there, fanning herself despite the chill, her expression one of acute social agony. And in a prominent seat near the front sat Mr. Randolph Vickers, looking smug and confident, occasionally whispering a condescending remark to his neighbour. At a table at the front of the hall sat the Duke, stern and impassive, with Constance seated beside him. Before them were her ledgers, stacked in a neat, formidable pile. Mr. Gideon Fenwick, the magistrate, presided, his granite face betraying nothing. The assembly began with the tenants. One by one, prompted by Mr. Fenwick, men like Jem and Abel stood and gave testimony. They spoke of the years of neglect under the previous steward, of the illegal fees, of the stolen funds for repairs. With each testimony, Constance would open a ledger and point to the corresponding fraudulent entry, her voice clear and calm as she explained the discrepancy. It was a slow, methodical demolition of the old regime. Mr. Vickers watched, a smirk playing on his lips. This was all ancient history, the word of peasants against his own standing. It meant nothing. Then, the Duke rose. "We have heard testimony regarding the past. Let us now turn to the present." He produced the forged eviction notice. "This document was delivered to the tenant Jem 2 weeks ago. Mr. Vickers, as a respected landowner and man of affairs, perhaps you would offer your opinion on its authenticity." This was the moment. Vickers preened, rising to his feet. He took the document and examined it with a theatrical air of expertise. "It appears perfectly authentic to me, Your Grace," he announced, his voice ringing with false authority. "The signature is yours, the seal is yours. A regrettable but, I am sure, necessary action against a defiant tenant." He shot a triumphant look at Constance. The trap was sprung. "Thank you for your expert opinion, Mr. Vickers," the Duke said, his voice dangerously smooth. He then turned to the back of the hall. "I would now like to call upon Mr. Ellery, of the county assayer's office. A small, spectacled man, whom no one had noticed, stepped forward, carrying a satchel. Vickers's confident expression faltered slightly. Mr. Ellery was a renowned expert in documents and inks. Mr. Ellery took the notice and placed a magnifying lens to the paper. "The penmanship is a masterful forgery, Your Grace," he began, "and the seal is an expert copy. However," he paused, letting the silence hang in the air, "the paper itself is the issue. This particular blend of linen rag paper, with a watermark from the Watman mill, was not commercially available until August of this year. The letter is dated in May." A gasp went through the hall. Vickers's face went pale. "Furthermore," Mr. Ellery continued, "I have had the opportunity to examine the wax of the seal. It contains microscopic traces of silver dust, a substance commonly used by jewelers when making a cast for a duplicate signet ring." The Duke let the information settle. Then he made his final move. "Mr. Fenwick, in his capacity as magistrate, took a statement this morning from a jeweller in Marley, a jeweller who recalled making a precise copy of the Kestrel Chase signet ring some 4 months ago. He was paid handsomely for his discretion." "He was paid?" The Duke's voice dropped, and his gaze locked onto Vickers like a hawk on a field mouse. "By Mr. Randolph Vickers." The silence in the hall was absolute. Every eye turned to Vickers. His face had crumpled, the handsome mask collapsing to reveal the panicked, guilty man beneath. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "You forged my name," the Duke said, each word a hammer blow. "You attempted to defraud my estate. You terrorized my tenants. And you slandered Miss Abbott, a woman whose integrity is worth more than your entire worthless name. You did it out of greed and spite, because she was undoing the web of corruption you have spun in this county for years." Lady Arabella let out a small, horrified shriek. Vickers, utterly broken, simply stared, his ruin complete and public. Mr. Fenwick rose. "Randolph Vickers," he said, his voice booming in the silent hall, "you will answer to the law for this." Constance sat very still, her hands resting on her ledgers. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vengeful. She felt a profound and quiet sense of balance. The accounts had been settled. The columns finally matched. She looked at the tenants, at Jem's face, where disbelief was slowly being replaced by a dawning, wondrous relief. She looked at the Duke, who was watching her, not with pity or triumph, but with a deep, unwavering respect. The reckoning was over. Her vindication was complete. After the assembly, after Vickers had been escorted away by the magistrate's men and the gentry had fled in a flurry of scandalized whispers, the great hall fell silent. The tenants had departed, their steps lighter, their voices full of a hope that had been absent for years. Only Constance and the Duke remained, standing in the vast, empty space, the dying afternoon light slanting through the high Gothic windows. The neat stacks of ledgers on the table between them were the only evidence of the battle that had just been won. Lucian walked around the table until he stood before her. The air was thick with unspoken things. The transactional nature of their agreement felt like a lifetime ago. "The terms of our arrangement are concluded," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its public authority. "You have restored order. You have exposed the corruption. The recovered rents and your commission will be transferred to your name tomorrow." You have earned your independence, Miss Abbott. Constance inclined her head. Thank you, Your Grace. This was it, the moment of her freedom. She could walk out of Kestrel Chase with a fortune, her own woman, beholden to no one. She could go anywhere, do anything. And yet, the thought of leaving this cold, magnificent house, of leaving the difficult, honorable man who stood before her, felt like tearing something vital from herself. I find, he continued, his gaze intense, that I do not wish you to leave. Her breath caught. I am a man of evidence, Constance, he said, and the sound of her name was a deliberate, meaningful choice. And the evidence shows me that this house has been a shell for 10 years, that I have been a shell. Since my wife's death, since the war, this place has been silent, cold. You have brought it back to life. You have brought me back to life. He took another step, closing the small distance between them. He did not reach for her. He simply stood there, offering his words, his truth, as plainly as she had offered hers in her ledgers. I am asking you to stay. Not as my steward. That position is beneath you. He paused, and his next words were heavy with the weight of his formidable will. I am asking you to be my partner. In all things. To run this estate, this house, this life, with me. Together. He slowly went down on one knee, a gesture of such profound humility from this proud, self-contained man that it struck her speechless. He took her hand, his fingers cool and strong around hers. Her own were stained with ink. I am asking you to be my wife, to be the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. Plainly. Will you have me, Constance Abbott? She looked down at him, this fortress of a man, kneeling before her in the hall where she had just won her own victory. He was not rescuing her. He was choosing her. He was recognizing her. He saw all of her, the mind that loved figures, the hands stained with ink, the heart that had refused to break. And he was choosing it all.
Tears, which she had held back for 14 years, suddenly welled in her eyes. Not tears of sorrow or humiliation, but tears of overwhelming, unexpected joy. She let one fall, a single, glittering drop that landed on his hand. Yes, she whispered. Her voice was thick with emotion, but it was clear. Yes, Lucian. Plainly. Yes. 2 years later, the Duchess of Kestrel Chase walked through the gardens of her home, a light shawl around her shoulders against the gentle autumn air. The gardens, once choked with weeds, were now a riot of late-blooming roses and asters, their scent sweet on the breeze. Kestrel Chase was no longer a silent monument. It was a home, filled with the warmth of roaring fires, the scent of baking bread, and the sound of quiet laughter. Constance was not the same woman who had arrived at Sorrel Down in a plain, gray dress. She was still Constance, her mind still sharp, her nature still composed, but a quiet confidence bloomed in her like the roses in her garden. She was loved, and she was an equal. Lucian came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. He had changed too. The harsh, sealed look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a steady warmth that was reserved only for her. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. The way he sought her opinion on everything from a new tenant lease to the color of a new set of curtains, the way his eyes followed her when she entered a room,
the way he would simply take her hand and hold it, as if to anchor himself. "Mr. Fenwick has sent the final papers," he said. "Vicar's lands have been forfeit to the Crown and sold. The proceeds will fund the new school in Dunsmere." "Jem's eldest daughter will be the first to attend," Constance said, a smile touching her lips. "She has a quick mind for figures." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out over the thriving estate. Sorrel Down, the once derelict steward's house, was now a cozy home for the widow of a tenant farmer, its garden tended and bright. Lady Arabella, her reputation and finances in tatters, was living in reduced circumstances in a boarding house in Bath, a distant, cautionary tale. Her cousin Philippa, having finally broken from her mother's toxic influence, had written a halting, sincere letter of apology and was now training to be a governess. The world had found its balance. Later that evening, in the library, Constance sat at the great oak desk, a new, beautifully bound ledger before her. It was not for rents or repairs. It was the household account book for Kestrel Chase. Lucian came and stood behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders as he looked down at the neat columns of figures. "Everything in order, Your Grace," he murmured, his lips brushing her hair. "Everything is in perfect order, Your Grace," she replied, leaning back against him. He reached down and gently closed the book. He took her ink-stained hands in his, turning them over and pressing a soft kiss to her palms. He was not a poet. He was not a man of grand, romantic pronouncements. But in that simple, quiet gesture, he said everything. He was honoring the work of her hands, the mind that had saved them both, the woman he had chosen. The accounts were settled, the ledgers were closed, and a new story, one of shared joy and quiet devotion, was just beginning. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.